Michel Wood, thank you so much for joining us on Viral History. Now, Harold Bloom famously described Shakespeare as inventing the human. Would you agree with that?
Many things go into Shakespeare, and his influences are very wide, very rich, very diverse, and we don't know some of them yet. But you could say Cervantes, Don Quixote, for example, is, a novel that does a lot of the same things. But he's no doubt a product of a time where inventing the human was of really great fascination to everybody. Not long ago, at a history festival, we had an evening's debate with all sorts of people like Susanna Lipscomb talking for Elizabeth, Ian Hislop for Shakespeare, and I talked for Alfred the Great, and the audience voted for Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great, I think, is the greatest Briton and one of the greatest rulers of all time. But Shakespeare, the next, and completely different, of course. Alfred's a man of action, carried out the most far-reaching ideas about society and the state, and was also, in a way, a philosopher prince. Shakespeare is in the entertainment industry. He's a writer, but his huge humanity, his view of the world and of power has just got more and more fascinating to the world, and still does in the 21st century. So in their different ways, they're incredible people. But you're studying events with Alfred the Great, whereas with Shakespeare, most of the commentaries on Shakespeare are really about his work. What also interests me is placing him as a Tudor male from relatively low farming family. The way I want to look at Shakespeare is also as a historian. The parents, the grandparents, and the social level that he's at, the changes that were happening in Tudor England, how they're reflected in his work. So I've got another sort of obsession. I'm fairly brusque with the Shakespeare deniers. It's a load of rubbish, to be honest. And there's a couple of things. It raises interesting questions. The key thing is that, is about what historians do. And this debate, like all other debates in history, is something that historians decide. And it's about sources, and historians construct their image of the past by sources. And you start with the primary sources, the first-hand, the eyewitnesses, the documents, the close-up. You move out to the others depending on what you've got. And if you're going to deny that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, you deny the primary sources, like the will, you see. So it is rubbish. And it comes, and of course nobody at the time thought that, and nobody for long after thought that anybody else but Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. It's a 19th century fantasy. And unfortunately, whereas conspiracy theory, you've only got to look at the recent American election, there's still lots of people think that the moon landing didn't happen, but it's as bonkers as that. But behind it lies a kind of ignorance, and the ignorance is about Tudor society, Lawrence Stone thought that Elizabethan England was the most literate society that had yet existed in history. 160 grammar schools founded in Elizabeth's reign alone. So this is the period when basic literacy had already existed even among the peasantry in England. But this is a period when people from ordinary families can rise up. And you look at the Shakespeare family and the Arden family's mother, and they're all husbandmen. They're above the ranks of labourers, but they're below the ranks of yeomen, let alone gentlemen. So they're that level, 100-acre farmers. But because his dad becomes an alderman in Stratford, he can send him to grammar school. And you do 7 years of Latin, you're much better at Latin than a graduate of Latin would be today, even perhaps at a really top university, So it's bonkers when people suggest that he couldn't have written. And the other thing, I know lots of people who are professional writers, and they're magpies, A friend of mine wrote a great book about women in the resistance in the war, and one of the chapters was about a woman in Poland, in Warsaw. And I don't think Kevin had ever been to Warsaw, but he got the 1939 guide to Warsaw, and he could tell you what bus you got to which corner, where the coffee bar was, You don't need to have been to Venice to know how to get to the Rialto. So it's nonsense on a total level. He's an intriguing character. I've often thought about him, you know, you live with him all your life, and you think, what sort of person was he? People say, what period would you like to go back to in history? And although I'm an Anglo-Saxonist, and I really would love to meet Alfred the Great or Athelstan, I'd have to say, if I only had one choice, that it would be late 1590s London, and I'd love to get a night in a pub with Shakespeare and his mates, you know. But I suppose, I think, probably he kept his cards very close to his chest. You know, you can see that, even as one of the sonnets says, how careful I was when I set out on my way to keep everything closed up like that. You know, and that's autobiographical to me. Skeptical about power. I imagine he, just to function in that society where you had to be very clever, very careful. You're doing plays for the public theatre. When there's a censor, you could get into deep trouble if you did the wrong thing. After the Essex Rebellion, the company called in to explain why they put the abdication play, Richard II, on the eve of the rebellion. And of course, the company very cleverly didn't send Shakespeare, they sent the accountant. And the accountant goes, well, you know, they offered us twice as much as our normal take. So you know, but you had to be very, very clever. So I'm not sure he would tell you very much, you know, but he'd be pleased. You know, sure, he was a man who was anxious for fame as well as money. He cared a lot about his public standing. When he first gets attacked in London in the 1590s, and he recruits quite high-ranking friends to go to the publisher and say, you've got to publish a retraction. You know, so he was really concerned about how he appeared, I think. So he'd be tickled pink, you know, as long as he got the royalties, that would be the thing. Yeah.
Now turning to your own history, as a grammar school boy from Manchester, you had a very significant trip to the Houses of Parliament where you met two very significant figures from history.
I was at school at the time. It was the 900th anniversary of the Norman Conquest, and you know, I wrote something in the papers that caused a bit of a stir, and I was invited by the great British war hero, Field Marshal Montgomery of Alamein, you know, commanded the British armies at D-Day and won Alamein, because I disputed his view of the Norman Conquest, you know, me a school kid and him a great national figure. And it was great fun, you know, and I met Atlee the year before he died, the old Labour Prime Minister, who was very, very sweet, actually. He's very, very kind, you know, perhaps because I was a kid, he made more of an effort to talk to me, you know. But it was all about the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons have been my great love, early English history, all through my life. And when I had Field Marshal Montgomery saying in print and on telly that the Anglo-Saxons were just backward load of long-haired woodsmen, and the Normans brought Norman civilization and discipline and culture, and I was furious, you know. So Atlee did say to me when I explained that I was there talking about this, he said, the Norman yoke, that old chestnut, you see. So he knew all about it because it was a big thing in the English radical tradition. The idea that the Norman Conquest had represented a break, with a fundamental break in English history, and that there had been certain rights and dues and under the law pre the conquest that we'd lost under the tyranny of the Normans. And the radicals in the English Revolution, the Levellers and the Diggers and all those people, believed by overthrowing King Charles, they were essentially getting rid of the Norman yoke. You know, so it was a very long-lasting myth in our history, and a myth that isn't entirely myth, you see. I think my argument would be that the English people, it was the biggest disaster ever suffered by the English people, and it took them a century or two to get over it, certainly a century to get over the active fallout of the Norman Conquest, brutal repression, apartheid, everything you name that was. But it took a lot longer for the idea to fade away that it had been this catastrophe, you know. And you can trace the myth all the way through, you know, past the English Civil War. But in the Civil War, it was a big thing. You look at the Putney debates that the army had in front of Fairfax and Cromwell and everywhere in Putney Church, 1647. You look at the writings of Gerard Winstanley, the great digger leader, you know, and they talk about the Norman Conquest as being this fundamental break. And they believed that the Anglo-Saxons had a more just and equitable polity before 1066. And, you know, to an extent that's myth. You know, the Anglo-Saxon kings could be ferociously cruel, and sometimes in their laws they were. But it's not entirely a fantasy. You know, the best of the Anglo-Saxon kings did attempt to create a humane and just society, even though, to our eyes, a lot of their punishments were severe. But, you know, there's a moment in Athelstan's law code where he's being badgered by his counsellor, and he says, "I'm sorry that law and order is in such a bad way as we see everywhere is the case, and my counsellors say I've borne it too long." And they lift the death penalty from, they fix the death penalty at 12. And then the king, shortly afterwards, sends a message to his counsellors saying, "This is too cruel. There's too many young people being executed. I've seen it everywhere. We're bringing the death penalty to 15. And this is in the 930s. But 8, 9, and 10-year-old children were executed under the law in the beginning of the 1800s, in Dickens's childhood, in England, for the theft of sheep or a small amount of money. See? So they were. That's what I love about the period. The Anglo-Saxons were wrestling with fundamental problems of justice and law and order. How do we create a just Christian society? You know, and you know, golden ages are really fascinating, and it's great to go to Florence and see, you know, Michelangelo and Leonardo, or walk through Hampton Court Palace and all that stuff, you know. But there's something about the Dark Ages and the early Middle Ages where they're trying from the very bottom to build things up when the learning has been destroyed, and there's something really moving and heroic about that, I think, and that's why Alfred the Great's the greatest Briton, you know. But that's why I love the Anglo-Saxons.
Now you're Professor of Public History in your hometown University of Manchester. What does that role encompass, and what does it mean to you?
Well, it was great to be asked. You know, Manchester is a very dynamic university, and a huge university, 40,000 students. And they have these external professors, Jeanette Winterson, for example, in English at the moment, following on Martin Amis. But this was the first time they'd appointed a Professor of Public History, and or anybody had, I think. And because of my life as a filmmaker, and actually the 3 years I've just done coincided with 3 years of filming in China for the story of China, so it was impossible to do undergraduate teaching. I do MA classes at film and history, that sort of stuff. But the big thing I try to do is, first of all, public events, and secondly, I do periods where I go around FE colleges, sixth form colleges, schools, and I talk about the value of history. I'll show clips from our films, and I try and excite the young people, you know, to study it. And I often go to places that, you know, you might not think are fruitful ground. You know, Bury, Oldham, Rochdale, Stockport, Blackpool, you know, those kind of places where there's a huge appetite to learn. You know, I've done classics once with 400 people, students in Moss Side in Manchester. You know, I had 300 in Blackpool at the big sixth form college there just 2 or 3 weeks ago. You know, so there's a huge appetite out there for history. And so I think, given that I'm a full-time professional filmmaker, my kind of part-time professorship, as it were, that's what I try and do really, is actually link with the public. I think we're living through times that are where the change is immense. You know, you kind of think, actually, there was no internet even when I was quite a way into my TV career. That's staggering to think, isn't it? Information is gathering and distribution is changing so fast. We don't watch television in the same way. Everything is moving so fast that people look at history as a means of saying, well, who are we? You know, you look at family history. Why has family history taken off so strongly now? I think people in very fast changing times, when the past appears to be receding from us at an ever increasing rate, people want to know, you know. I found this, it's not just us, I found this in China. Everywhere we went in China, you know, they've gone through an incredible period of change since 1949, you know. And before that, foreign invasion, the Japanese invasion, civil war, the communist revolution, 2 and a bit decades of absolute chaos, cruelty, tyranny, really. And now that freedoms are starting to come again in China, everybody wants to know about the past. And where Chairman Mao wanted the past destroyed, you know, in the Cultural Revolution, you actually had to bring out your family documents and treasures and burn them. And people went to all kinds of lengths to preserve them. And all through our journeys these last 3 years, you don't even need to ask. You say, where did this come from? And they say, well, when the Red Guards came, Grandma came and said, come with me, and we buried it in the garden, and we saved this, we hid this in the roof. And now everybody wants to know, and they're all going back to these rituals for the ancestors that were so important to them in the past. So I think it's a global thing. You know, history is what locates us. History gives value and meaning to the present. And you learn it through your family, through your neighborhood, through school, then your city, then your region, then your nation, and it locates you in the world that way as you grow up, from the perspectives when you're little to when you're big. And it's a lifelong process. But it's our reality check. You know, to be without history, you know, as an individual human being, if somebody says you have no memory, it is deemed to be a form of mental illness, to have no memory as an individual person. That tells you how important it is to be able to locate yourself and your own past with people around you. It's also when I say it's a reality check, history well done really is a reality check. You've only got to look at a totalitarian state like North Korea to see how the fantasy visions of a totalitarian state which deny the reality of history literally separate the people from many of the definable realities that make up our world. You know, so even though it's not a crucial curriculum subject, history to me is an absolutely vital part of us as human beings. And if you look at history in terms of the way we all receive it, you know, it's not a big deal on the curriculum for obvious reasons, you know. But we all become historians in our part-time. It's the biggest, on the stats, history is the biggest leisure participation activity in the UK. 70 million museum visits a year, National Trust, English Heritage, history societies, local groups, a myriad things, you know. All of us, you know, in some way engage with this, I think. So, you know, I'm a great believer that it's there, even if you don't necessarily, you know, study it.